Yes. Okay, well, welcome again to the 2018 Penn Neuroscience Public Lecture. We're so excited you're here. So by raise of hand, tell me which one of you guys are not scientists and not working in science? Wonderful. That's the people we want to see in this lecture hall. So everyone else, get out of here. Okay. Okay. So, well, welcome again. And my name is Cedric. I'm a senior MD PhD student here at the Perelman School of Medicine. And this year's topic is uncovering the neuroscience of mental illness. And I adapt the following introduction from one of my favorite scientists and psychiatrist, Tom Insel. So let's start with some good news, shall we? And the good news has to do with what do we know based on biomedical research that has changed the outcome of very serious diseases. And let's start with HIV and AIDS. So incredibly, it has recently been renamed chronic disease, meaning that a 20-year-old today who contracted HIV does not have to expect to live only for days or months or years, but really for decades. And they are more likely to die in their 60s and 70s of some other causes of death altogether, and not from AIDS or HIV. And malignant cancer is another great example of this. And so, for example, leukemia in children used to have a mortality rate of over 95%, now has brought down by 85%. But if you really want big numbers about this, look no further than heart diseases. And heart disease used to be the biggest killers of Americans, particularly for men in their 40s. And now we see a 63% reduction. So remarkably, 1.1 million deaths averted every year. And these are just some examples of the remarkable changes of the outlook of very serious diseases. And these remarkable stories, good news stories about medicine, all of which boil down to understanding something about the disease that have allowed us to detect early and intervene early. And early detection and early intervention, that's the story for the success. But unfortunately, the news is not all good. Let's talk about another example, which is suicide. Now, of course, suicide is not a disease per se. It's a condition or situation that leads to mortality, which you just may not realize how prevalent it is. So every year in the US, 38,000 suicide occurs, and that's about 1 in 15 minutes. So it's one of the top 3 killers of people between the age of 15 and 25. And this has become truly extraordinary when you realize that this is twice as common, twice as much as homicide in this country, and a lot more common than the traffic fatalities in the US. Now, we talk about suicide because there's a medical contribution here, because 90% of all suicide is related to mental illness, such as depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anorexia, borderline personality disorder. There's a long list of contributors that contribute to this. But it's not just mortalities of these disorders, it's also the morbidity. If you look at the disability measured by the World Health Organization, something they call the disability-adjusted life years, it's a one-way trying to capture what's lost from disability due to medical causes. And as you can see, virtually 30% of all medical 30% from all medical causes can be attributed to neuropsychiatric disorders. And you're probably thinking, that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, cancer seems much more serious. Heart diseases seem much more serious. But you can see that they're actually much further down on the list. And that is because we're talking about disability. But what is driving this high level of disability caused by conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar depression? Why are they number 1 on this list? Well, there are probably 3 reasons. First, they are highly prevalent. About 1 in 5 people will suffer from one of these disorders in the course of their lifetime. And the second, of course, is that for some people, these conditions become truly disabling. That's about 4 to 5%, right? Which is about 1 in 20. But really, what drives these high numbers of disability is this high mobility and to some extent a high mortality as well, is the fact that these psychiatric conditions start very early on in life. 50% will have onset by the age of 14 and 75% by the age of 24. A picture that's very different from other conditions that you would think about that's more serious, like cancer or heart diseases. And these psychiatric disorders are indeed chronic illness of young people. But what I've been talking to you so far, and even the title of today's the public lecture series is called Mental Disorders, the Disease of Mind. And that's actually becoming a rather unpopular term these days, right? People feel that for whatever reason, it's politically better to use the term behavioral disorders and to talk about these as disorders of behavior. But what I want to prime you in listening from the speakers about to come up here is that both of these terms, mental disorders and behavioral disorders, they have been in play for centuries and even more, are actually now impediments to progress. That we need to conceptually to make progress here is to rethink these disorders as brain disorders. And now for some of you, you might say, oh my God, here we go again. We're going to hear about a chemical imbalance, or we're talking about drugs, or we're going to hear about some very simplistic notion that somehow we take our subjective experiences and turn it into some very flat, one-dimensional understanding of what it is to have depression or schizophrenia. But make no mistake. When we talk about the brain, it is anything but simplistic or unidimensional. It depends on, of course, the scale or scope you want to think about, whether it is an organ of, truly an organ of surreal complexity. And we're just beginning to understand how to even study it, whether you're thinking about the brain based on the 100 billion neurons or based on the 100 trillion synapses that make up all the connections. And then we have just begun to try to figure out how we take this very complex machine that does extraordinary kinds of information processing. Now, already in the case of brain disorders that we have, that I've mentioned, depression, schizophrenia, post-traumatic disorder, while we don't yet have in-depth understanding of how they are abnormally configured or what the brain is doing in these illnesses, we have been able to already identify some of the connectional differences or some of the ways in which the circuitry is different for people who have these conditions. And we call this the human connectome. And you can think about the connectome sort of as the wiring diagram of the brain. You will hear more about this from our speakers. But the important piece here is that as we begin to look at people who have these disorders, the 1 in 5 of us who struggle in some way, you will find that there is, of course, a lot of variations in the way that the brain is wired, but there are some predictable patterns, and these patterns are risk factors for developing these disorders. And you can, if you will, think of this as, on one hand, neurological disorders like a heart attack, where a part of the heart tissue is dead, versus arrhythmia, more like psychiatric disorders, where the heart is simply not functioning because of the communication problems within it. Either one will kill you, but only one of them you will find a major lesion. So for brain disorders, behavior is the last thing to change. We know from Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, there are brain changes decades before the symptoms of behavior emerge. And now the new tools are showing us the presence of these brain changes long before the symptoms emerge. But more importantly, going back to the good news, where we started, the good news about medicine, our early detection and early intervention. If we waited until the heart attack to come, then we would be sacrificing those 1.1 million lives every year due to heart diseases. And this is precisely what we're doing when we call one of these brain circuit disorders behavior disorders. We wait until the behavior to become obvious. And that is not early detection, and that's not early intervention. But now to be very clear, we don't know how to do this yet. We don't have all the facts. We don't actually even know what the tools will be or what to precisely look for in every case. But this tells us how we ought to be thinking about this and where we need to go. And today, here to help us to shed light on these topics are three extraordinary Penn Neuroscience faculty. First, we will hear from Dr. Yvette Schilling, who will be talking about brain damage from depression, what, why, and how to prevent it. And then we'll be hearing from Dr. Raquel Gore about risk and resilience in development. And finally, Dr. Desmond Oates, who will be talking about why hasn't brain imaging helped us to fix mental illness and what should we do about it. All right, so